Hello, this is BBC World News Today. I'm Ben Bland. Our top stories. Kurdish forces announce a deal with the Syrian government to allow the army to take control of Kurdish territory to halt an invasion by Turkey.
And I'm Kasia Madeira in Warsaw, where the exit polls in Poland's general elections suggest that the ruling Conservative Law and Justice Party have won a second consecutive term with a decisive majority.
And Rugby World Cup history is made as Japan beats Scotland to go through to the quarter-finals for the first time ever. Hello and welcome to BBC World News Today. The Syrian army has begun moving troops to the north of the country to, as Syrian state media puts it, confront Turkish aggression. The Turkish military is currently carrying out an operation to create what it calls a safe zone in Syrian territory along their common border. That has led to fighting against the Kurdish-led opposition forces that currently control that area. This map gives you an idea of where the advances have been taking place. Turkey now claims to have driven the Kurds out of two key towns, Ras Al Ain and Tal Abyad. This video showing Turkish forces in Tal Abyad appears to support that claim. Most civilians have fled the area. The UN says more than 130,000 people have been displaced by the Turkish military operation. And there's been another potentially serious consequence. On Sunday, the Kurds said that nearly 800 family members of fighters from the Islamic State group have escaped from a detention camp in the confusion after a Turkish airstrike. Our correspondent Ali Makbul is in the region and sent this report.
The anguish that only comes from loss. This brother and sister mourn their father, who was killed in the shelling by Turkey of their residential neighborhood. The Kurds here have already suffered so much, and every day of Turkey's offensive brings new chaos. These were just a handful of the hundreds of women and children who, as Turkish attacks got closer, today escaped a Kurdish camp that held them. They were mainly relatives of Islamic State group fighters. The BBC team had access to the camp just last week, where they found Amira, who was brought to Syria 5 years ago by her British parents. Her two sisters, brother, and both her parents were killed in the final onslaught against IS.
They came and opened them both. So then my mum died, my little brother, my sister.
Amira's fate, but also that of scores of female IS members, is now unknown. It's not the first massive security breach brought on by the Turkish aggression. 5 captured IS fighters escaped from a prison here too, after it was shelled. We found it abandoned. The remaining prisoners moved into other already overwhelmed facilities. The authorities here say they are already struggling with the resources to hold many thousands of what are among the most dangerous prisoners in the world from the so-called Islamic State group. What they warn is that with any further destabilization caused by this assault from Turkey, many more could escape, potentially regroup, undoing the massive effort it took to capture them and take their territory back. Already, IS says it was responsible for this car bomb that killed 3 people. The fear is far worse is to come. And the atrocities against the Kurds here are now coming from so many angles. All the while, Turkey's offensive goes on. This evening, a convoy travelling close to the border was attacked, and the number of Kurdish casualties continues to mount. Ali Makbul, BBC News in northeastern Syria.
Well, with me is our Middle East regional editor, Sebastian Usher. Sebastian, events moving very rapidly on this fifth day of the Turkish operation. And what's interesting is the way the dynamic in the region is changing as well.
Yes, and what we were just hearing there from Alim is how the Turks are continuing, strong progress. They've taken more towns, more villages. And in response to this, essentially, we've seen the US up the timetable of its withdrawal of troops. The US Defense Secretary, Mark Esper, said their situation was no longer, they could no longer guarantee the safety of the troops, and that has to be the first priority of the Americans. So he's saying up to 1,000 will be pulled out as soon as they possibly can. Now that, as we know already, the Kurds felt abandoned by the Americans. It emboldened the Turks to move in. So talks had been going on, we know, for some time between the Kurds. They'd said, essentially, this is one of the cards they were playing. If we have to, we'll go to Damascus, we'll go to President Assad. Now, this evening, they've announced they've done a deal with President Assad. As we were hearing there, Syrian government forces have been mobilized, they're moving further north. What the Kurds say is the Syrian government troops are going essentially to spread across the border, and they're going to secure the border against the Turkish offensive. They'll presumably be trading of towns that the Kurds still hold, possibly Manbij, possibly Kobani. These are names that we've seen throughout the conflict. Kobani was a major battleground previously with ISIS. So it's in upheaval again, this region. The cards, the pieces have been scattered once more and are going to have to be put back on the table, and maybe, in a different way, just when certain aspects of the Syrian conflict seem to be coming to an end. There's a lot to play for again.
I mean, this development about the Syrian army moving towards the north of the country to this region where Turkey is carrying out the military operation, it might seem to some like we now have a sort of a squaring up to Turkey over this, and I just wonder what Turkey's next move is likely to be.
Well, Turkey, President Erdogan, have been very, very clear, defiant throughout. When sanctions have been threatened by the US, by European countries, said that doesn't matter. We're going ahead, whatever happens. Now, Turkey and the Syrian government's main backer, Russia, have come much closer. I mean, they supported opposite sides throughout most of the conflict, but they've been leading, a path towards some kind of resolution to the conflict. This could potentially pit them against you, because obviously Russia is involved with Damascus. If the troops are moving to the border, potentially squaring off against the Turks, you would imagine there's a possibility of a new confrontation, but you also imagine that behind the scenes more deals are being done, that this isn't something that's come out of the blue. This was a known, this was likely to happen. The Kurds run out of options, this is what they were going to do. So the Russians, the Turks, one assumes have been discussing this, have been finding ways perhaps to try to ensure that direct confrontations are avoided, that the Syrian government is not necessarily fighting directly against Turkish forces. For the Turks, perhaps having the Syrian government there as a buffer isn't the worst possible option. We'll have to wait and see.
OK, Sebastian, many thanks indeed. Sebastian Usher there, our Middle East regional editor. You find much more on our website, including this article, which explains the history of mistrust and violence between Turkey and the Kurds. You can find it just by logging on to bbc.com/news. Exit polls in the Polish parliamentary elections suggest the Nationalist Conservative Law and Justice Party has won 43.6% of the vote and 239 seats, with the Civic Coalition Party at 27.4% and 130 seats. If the exit poll is confirmed by the official results expected on Monday, then the right-wing Law and Justice Party has won a slightly improved mandate compared to elections 4 years ago. My colleague Kasia Madeira has the very latest for us from Warsaw. Kasia.
Ben, no surprise, no real surprise as to who the winner is. Law and Justice were polling very, very strongly into the run-up to these elections. But everybody was watching whether they would once again get a majority. And as you say, these are exit polls. The final results will change slightly when the Electoral Commission publishes them in the next day or two. But if the exit polls suggest their Law and Justice is predicted to have 239 seats, which means that they are clear of that majority. They would have needed 231 to form a majority government. It is the second time that they have won a majority. It is only the second time in Polish history that one party has won a majority. We've got all the numbers and the figures. To discuss them with me, I'm joined by Esther Figer from the Liberal